30% of our planet was covered in glaciers. The outer core is not slowing and reversing its direction. It's still flowing in the same direction. The inner core is going through a shift. So let me be really clear. We need to stop burning oil. Remote viewing, I think, is very valid in the present moment. If a remote viewer sees nothing beyond the year 2030, I would take that to mean that we're all in for a big change, and we already know that. We're on the road to a big change right now. The oceans are responsible for over 90% of the CO2 that is released into the atmosphere. If you look at what the records are showing us, is we are in the low end of CO2 historically for Earth. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at this chart. Can we return to a world without oil? That's the question that has come in from a number of different people. My first response is, why would you want to? And the answer to that is the reflection of what I've just mentioned about the mainstream media, because oil has been demonized in our culture. And unfortunately, we have now going on 2 generations of young people that are being taught that oil is bad, oil is evil. They've been taught to hate and fear oil. And they have been taught, and they believe that they are justified in vandalizing equipment, personal property, technologies that are using oil in the society that we have today. They feel they're justified in doing that because of the lies, and they are flat out lies, that they have been taught when it comes to oil. So I'm going to answer this honestly. And the answer may surprise some people, and I'd love to know what you think about it, in the comments below. Before you comment, please hear the entire presentation here. What happens a lot of times is people will just read the little caption, or they'll see the first couple of minutes and they'll start firing back before they get to the end of my conversation, where they find that more often than not, I'm on board with them. I'm thinking the same way that they are. They just didn't hear me out long enough to see that. So let me be really clear. We need to stop burning oil. And we need to stop burning oil as transportation fuels. We need to stop burning oil to fuel the generators that provide electricity for our nation, for many nations right now. And as the push for electrification of our society increases, one of the big questions becomes, where's that electricity come from? Right now, it is primarily petroleum-based electricity. It doesn't have to be, but it is. So I'm just being very clear up front. We need to go clean. We need to go green if we can really define clearly what green is, and we'll talk about that. We need to stop burning oil. So why would we want to return to a world without oil when so much of our lives are based upon oil? Now, a lot of people believe that oil simply is used, to fuel automobiles, trains, planes, and things like that. They're not aware of how deeply ingrained petroleum products in our everyday lives. So I'm going to just begin. When I was in school, I was fascinated by this. Petroleum, it's what are called hydrocarbons. They are organic materials that are produced in the earth over long periods of time, primarily hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, some methane. It's still a mystery. We think we understand it, but we've never seen it happen. We think we understand how oil is produced, and one of the big mysteries is scientists still are not absolutely certain, because it appears that some of it may be from life, living creatures and plants that have been with us in the past. There are studies that are showing that oil may be the product of meteorite impacts and the chemical processes that result from those meteorite impacts. There's pretty much an agreement that it is a finite resource. There's a lot of it, and it is finite. The easy oil, the oil that's easy to get to, since the late 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s, has been largely exploited, with a couple of exceptions in places that are hard to get to. So now it is more difficult to access the oil in its pure state And this is one of the reasons we've gone to shale oils, where the oil is locked up in shale that can be accessed using new technologies. Here's the thing. This is what's so interesting to me. Oil is one of the few chemical compounds that we cannot reproduce artificially. We run out of oil, we cannot make oil to replace the oil that we're running out of. Why would we want to do that? Well, here's the mind blower. Over 6,000 items in your daily life and my daily life right now depend upon petroleum products. Over 6,000. I don't think we'd want to live in a world where we didn't have those products. We wouldn't be having this conversation because the computers that we're using to have this conversation, the components of the computers, the electronics within those components, the printed circuits, the wiring, the cables, the internet technology is all based upon petroleum. We couldn't even have this conversation. So a lot of people don't think about that. Let me just share. I put together a couple of things, or I won't read all 6,000, I promise, but I want to give you a sense. Medical supplies. We all rely on medical supplies in one way or another at some form of our life, sometime in our lives, either for ourselves or for our loved ones. Medical devices rely upon petroleum-based products for the plastics, for the casings and the housings. Hospital equipment, IV bags. If you don't have an IV bag of using petroleum products, I mean, I guess we could use goat skins, but now you're killing a lot of animals for something like this, and we've got conditions of hygiene. Antihistamines, aspirins, artificial limbs, dentures, hearing aids, heart valves, many of these things, and much more. These all rely upon petroleum-based products. Electronics. And when we think about the electronics that we use in our everyday lives, where are the electronics? Well, I can just tell you right now, that's what we've talked about, the casings for the computers and the chips and the way the chips are manufactured, solar panels, wiring, cables. We want electric cars, we've got to have copper wire, and that copper wire is derived through petroleum-based products and processes. Solar panels are intensely petroleum-based energy intensive. It takes a lot of petroleum energy, hydrocarbon energy, to create the solar panels themselves. The moldings for the panels, the way the silicon has to be produced under high heat, that can only be achieved right now through petroleum and the gas-fired plants can't do it in other ways. So young people aren't being taught to think about these things. They're being taught that oil is bad, that it's a bad thing. They're being taught that carbon dioxide is bad, to fear CO2. And I want to tell you, you don't want to live in a world where we are lacking in CO2. We're not the highest place in geologic history. We don't have the greatest amounts of CO2 that we've ever had. There are times in the past, a geologic time called the Cambrian. We had over 4,000 parts ppm, 4,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And what happened during the Cambrian is called the Cambrian explosion of life. Life thrives on high levels of CO2 in terms of plants. I think we all know that we exhale CO2 and breathe oxygen. Plants do just the opposite. They are exhaling the oxygen or emitting the oxygen, but they thrive on the CO2. So it's no surprise that in the past, when the CO2 levels were higher, life thrived, and we had more of a diversity, and new forms of life were emerging. Temperatures were warmer, but they didn't prevent life from living, obviously. And we've had times when the CO2 levels dropped dangerously low. So during the Pleistocene, the period we typically think of as the glacier period, it's about 30% of our planet was covered in glaciers. And what it did was it prevented a lot of the green life. Forests were decimated during this time, especially in parts of the northern hemisphere. But the CO2 levels dropped to just below 180 parts per million. And this is when we saw the extinction of many forms of life, many plants, many flowering plants, many the forests, many of the larger mammals, the mastodons, for example, and things like that. This is when they went extinct. There wasn't food for them. You don't want to see an Earth with less than 180 parts per million. But this is the whole point. We as adults and children, our young people are being taught in terms of extremes rather than common sense and accepting the data from the past that tells us what can happen in these different conditions. The extremes are that carbon is bad. So oil is bad, CO2 is bad, but look at what's really happening. I want to invite you to go a little deeper with this. You and I are carbon-based beings. We are carbon-based life. And that carbon-based life is being demonized. It's coming under attack as well. And this is one of the foundational thinkings in what's called the transhuman movement. The thinking that humans are a flawed species of life, that the things that make us uniquely human, the things that we cherish, like our memories of the past, like our ability to have deep emotion, compassion, empathy, sympathy. The transhuman movement believes that those are flaws in our existence, and their answer to those flaws is to weed them out through technology to replace our carbon-based bodies with artificial intelligence, with computer chips, with wires, with chemicals, with synthetic skin. So really all that's left is the human brain, and they even propose replacing the brain through computer-based technology to make us immortal. I've done other videos on this. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I'm giving you a big picture. The extremes. We are being conditioned, and our children are being conditioned to hate and to fear carbon in the form of petrochemicals, in the form of CO2, in the form of the human body itself. This is a slippery slope in my perspective, from my way of thinking. It's a dangerous way of thinking, and it's often marketed in really very cool, sexy, high-tech TV ads and things like that that convey these ideas, but they do it in a way that's so slick you don't even know what's happening. So what I'm saying to you in answer to this question, can we return to a world without oil? The answer is yes. We could certainly return to a world without oil. It'd be a primitive world. And a lot of people think, okay, we just stop using the oil and we sit around on our internet and our computers and we solve all. You wouldn't have internet. You wouldn't have computers. You wouldn't have wires. You wouldn't have cables. You wouldn't have insulation. And these are all things I think we really need to think about. So I believe that oil is so precious because it's so precious, because it is finite, because it cannot be replaced chemically. We need to stop burning it as soon as possible. But that doesn't mean that we have to collapse an entire petrochemical industry and put hundreds of thousands or millions of people out of work, because we still need the product. We just don't need it to burn. And certainly there are ways we can clean this up. We can become way more efficient. We can use petrochemicals much more efficiently. And I'm not justifying fracking or any of those kinds of things. I'm going for the principles here. The principle is that carbon and oil and natural gas and carbon dioxide are not bad. We don't have to fear them. We don't have to hate them. And I hope that we learn to appreciate them and allow them to serve us in our lives as it gives us a buffer. Allow them to serve us in our lives now as we're building the new technologies that will take us beyond the need for some of these things. Maybe we will find a way to replace oil at some point in the future. But we don't have that right now. So I just wanted to share these perspectives. There's much more that we could say about this. But I wanted to talk to you about this. First of all, this was the first question here. I'm going to do one more. But I want to know how you think about this. And I mean, I could go through the textiles. Our textiles are based upon petroleum-based products. Agriculture is largely produced. You say, well, we don't need oil to grow food. You've got to pull water out of the ground to water your food. That water is running on pumps. Pumps are either running on oil or they're running on the electricity that is driven by some kind of carbon-based process. Sure, we can do it with solar panels. Sure, we can do it with a windmill. We can do it with geothermal. In some locations, it's not universal. It's not a universal answer. So rather than, this is a way of thinking, rather than judging ourselves as making mistakes and choosing the wrong path 100 or 150 years ago when we went with oil, we can do that. And when we do that, what happens is we beat ourselves up and we are ridden with guilt, and there's anger, and there's hate, and there's fear about the use of petroleum products in our lives today. There's another option. We can say, you know what, we're on a learning curve, and those petroleum products helped improve the lives of people all over the world. Sure, there are things we could have done better, and there are things we could have done differently, and if we go back in time, we probably would. But if we can think of ourselves today as on this learning curve where we are outgrowing the thinking of the past, opening the door to new thinking in the future, I think it's a much healthier way with much less suffering. If we were to eliminate petroleum from our lives today, the people that could least afford it would be the ones that would suffer the most. And I think that suffering is unnecessary. So rather than a world without oil, I prefer to have a world, live in a world where we revere the natural processes and the substance that Mother Earth has given to us to allow us to develop our intellect and our psyche through computers and technologies. And from that, we evolve to the point where we transcend the need to use these products as we have in the past, and we can use them more wisely. What my thoughts are on the projects that are using remote viewing to look into our immediate future, the year 2030 and beyond. There's a lot of focus on the year 2030 right now for a lot of reasons. United Nations has identified that year as when they hope to have implemented the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You may have seen in some of the other videos that I've offered my feeling about those goals. The goals themselves, I think, are worthy goals. The devil, you've heard, is in the details of the fine print of how we achieve those goals. And when you look at what is proposed to achieve those goals, it is horrendous. I cannot support it, and I will not support it. Not only will I not support it, I will work to find new ways to achieve those goals without causing the suffering and without the loss of so many of the values that we cherish as individuals and societies that must be compromised to achieve those goals. But they're all focused on this year 2030. So when we talk about remote viewing, I think most of you are familiar with remote viewing. If you're not, briefly, it's an intuitive process where an individual is able to travel, or sometimes what they call project conscious awareness along a timeline to a point in the past or anywhere geographically in the present or into the future to give us insights into what might be happening. So let me be really clear. I think remote viewing is valid. I've toured with Russell Targ. I was privileged to tour with Russell Targ in the past, one of the founders of remote viewing through Stanford Research Institute, SRI, back in the, I think it's back in the 1970s when he founded that project. And others, it is a valid phenomenon. Here's the thing. Remote viewing, I think, is very valid in the present moment, where an individual can be at one location, one place, and one time and project their consciousness in this present frame of time to another geographic location on the Earth. This is what the U.S. military was using remote viewing for during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in Iraq, 1990-91. They were using remote viewers to find Scud missiles in the Iraqi desert to pinpoint those locations, so they didn't have to risk the lives of military men and women going out to verify that the Scud missiles were actually there. And it worked. It was a very effective way for them, a high success rate, so it worked. Here's where we run into problems, and this is where this question, well, I think this is an important question. When we're projecting our consciousness forward in time, what we're doing is intuitively we are projecting our awareness along a timeline, And that timeline is moving from our point forward. Einstein had no problems with time either moving forward or backward. Forward or backward. So we're looking forward in time, okay, to the year 2030. And what a lot of the remote viewers are seeing is nothing. They're saying after 2030, they don't see anything there. They said the same thing around 2012. We saw this a lot. Remote viewers saying, man, it's the end of the world. I never said that. People accuse me of saying that. I never said that. I said just the opposite. It's the end of a cycle. And by definition, it's the beginning of what comes next. When a remote viewer is projecting along a timeline, here's the problem. That timeline is subject to many bifurcations. Every time you make a new choice in your life, you bifurcate your personal timeline. You split off from the timeline that you were just traveling with your new choice. And then when you and your family make choices, you're creating a bifurcation. When you and your community, when you and your society, when you and your nation, when you and your planet make choices, we are constantly creating these bifurcations. Some are more significant than others. Some are just little, little bifurcations, little deviations that really don't make that much difference. If you stay in the same relationship you're in now and you're in that relationship in 2030, that's one timeline. If you in that relationship and choose a new one, that's a bifurcation. How significant that bifurcation is determined by the choices that lead to the new partnership or the new relationship. And the same can be said for our nation, and the same can be said for the planet. So the danger and the drawback of relying upon remote viewing to tell us what's going to happen and then reacting to that, where people are saying, we don't see anything after 2030, must mean it's the end of the world, must mean there's a big war, must mean it's all over. People get frightened. I know people that are running up debt that they feel they won't have to pay in the next 9 years between now and 2030, or they're selling their family farms, or they're making big life choices based upon what they are interpreting from these stories of remote viewers. So I think remote viewing is useful. It can be a guideline. And if a remote viewer sees nothing beyond the year 2030, I would take that to mean that we're all in for a big change, and we already know that. We're on the road to a big change right now. We're living a convergence of natural rhythms and cycles that our society has been reluctant to embrace, to talk about. Even when I was in school, nobody wanted to talk about it. We're living a cycle of climate shift. It's a natural rhythm, natural cycle. If we weren't here, we would still be living this cycle. We're adding to it, but we didn't cause it. So we are living this climate rift, number one. We are living a natural cycle of economic change. It's coming up for us right now. It doesn't mean that it has to be bad. It's how the powers that be maneuver within these cycles. So we can do really good things, or we can do really terrible things. Is it based on greed, or is it based on love? Is it based upon the recognition that the convergence of cycles opens the door to new opportunities where we can serve one another in really beautiful ways, or we can raise the standard of living for every human on the face of the earth without taxing our resources in the ways that we have in the past? We have the technology to do that. We have the technology to bring electricity to every man, woman, and child in every community, in every society that wants it. Not all societies want electricity, but for those that do, we can do it without burning any fossil fuels. We've had that technology for over 70 years. If the powers that be were serious about eliminating CO2, they would embrace those technologies. They have not as of yet. I think they will in the near future. And this is no secret. We know this. We know this. The key is the third cycle that's converging now is a cycle of conflict. Now, this is really interesting for me. I had the opportunity, many of you have seen the videos, with my dear friend, my brother, my colleague, my spiritual brother, my colleague, Dr. Bruce Lipton. And we were invited to speak at the United Nations a few years ago about what we saw coming in the years ahead between 2015 and 2030. What do we see happening in those years? I shared with them what I'm sharing now and all the graphs that go with it. I've talked about this so many times. People felt like I was being redundant. Where we're living this cycle where the climate change is converging with the economic change that is converging with a cycle of conflict. Uh, this cycle of conflict was supposed to peak in the year 2020. Now, when we shared this with the UN, they were surprised. They said, how come we've never heard of this? Doesn't conflict just happen spontaneously? Don't wars just happen when they happen? And the answer is, well, they can, but there is a rhythm. And what we see is there are 56-year cycles, there are 17.7-year cycles, and many of these cycles are driven by our relationship to the sun, interestingly enough. Now, for some people that sounds pretty out there, but I tell you, the US military is really on board with what I'm sharing with you here. And the Institute of Heart Math has done a lot of the research showing us that the cycles of the sun influence magnetic fields of the Earth. The cycles of the sun are driven by the ebb and flow of the sun's magnetic fields. And there are many magnetic fields on the sun. That's what the sunspots are. Each sunspot is a magnetic field. It's a little magnetic disturbance. And when those magnetic fields are strong and the magnetic fields of the Earth are strong, we are less aggressive. We are more cooperative. This happens in your family, in your relationships. This happens in your workplace, happens between nations. We are much more willing to work together and cooperate to solve our problems. When the magnetic fields are weak, the opposite of all that is true. What's happening now is we are in a relatively weak magnetic field. We're in between solar cycles. We are now in a new solar cycle ramping up to a peak, but we're still at a low point in the current solar cycle. And those solar cycles also influence climate change as well. So we are living a time where we are vulnerable. We are susceptible to conflict, but it doesn't mean we have to be driven by these cycles. If we're aware of them, if we know that these are happening, then we can use these times of vulnerability as opportunities for peace and cooperation. And what the cycles show very clearly is that the greatest periods of conflict, as well as the greatest times of peace, the greatest opportunities of war and the greatest opportunities of peace, come at the peaks and the valleys of where we are with the solar cycles and conflict. So you can see that the beginning of World War I, beginning of World War II, the end of World War I, the end of World War II, all of those are at the peaks and the valleys. And where we are right now is we are at a peak where we are most vulnerable. We can get through this year, 2022, we begin to go down to become less and less vulnerable. So what this says to me, and this is what we share with the UN, if you know you're in these cycles and you are conscious that these cycles may influence choices that we make, and that is the opportunity to do a number of things when it comes to conflict. And this is true for you and your family and the people you share your home with, under your roof, and your most intimate moments, and it's true between nations. When we're in these cycles, it's an opportunity to become even better listeners, to listen, to give the other person, the other party, the benefit of the doubt, to extend the olive branch of peace, knowing that we are vulnerable to these cycles. And as I said, it's the greatest opportunity for peace that we have right now because of where we are in the cycles, if we recognize that that opportunity is there. Now, of course, you can always have conflict, you can always have war and peace anytime. What I'm saying is the deck is stacked in our favor during the peaks, the ebbs and the flows of these cycles. So the fact that all three of these cycles are converging, climate, economy, and conflict, it is a perfect storm, a perfect recipe for change. Big, big change. This isn't the little stuff. This isn't the fluffy stuff. I mean, this is the big change. So I'm not surprised that, getting back to the question here, that a remote viewer looking 9 years from now, looking down the timeline from where we are now, as if nothing has changed, if nothing had changed, I think the remote viewer would see the world and what we could expect. The fact that they're seeing nothing says that there is a big change, and there are ways, there are techniques in remote viewing to navigate those bifurcated timelines, and there are some good remote viewers that have learned to do that. Some of the ones we're seeing on YouTube, I don't know that that's the case. I don't know that it's not. But I don't know that that's the case. And the fact that they're seeing nothing publicizing that, people are frightened by what they read into that. And that's why I wanted to answer this question and share this with you. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the world. It could be the end of that timeline. And the choices, man, we're making choices right and left today. The choices that we're making are causing the bifurcations that lead us away from that timeline.
Over the last years, as this awakening has accelerated, it's been going on for much longer, but it has really accelerated, especially 2019, 2020. It was like a switch was flipped, and for many people, the veil was lifted, and just an onslaught of truths that came to them. One of the things that I believe we're going through is this manifestation of truth, period. We all want to know the truth about who we are, what kind of realm we live in, what our history is. And when we look, you have dedicated your life to discovering the truth about our history, where we come from, what we went through, how we came here. What is your take? How important is it for us to discover what really happened in order to move forward in a better way?
Now, as a geologist, I'm taught to think in terms of systems. I'm a systems thinker, the big picture, and then the immediate experience. And I'm taught to think in time in terms of hundreds of thousands, millions of years. We don't think about that a lot. So it's possible that we can miss the cycles that are playing out right in front of our faces because we're so zeroed in on 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Nature doesn't work in those kinds of cycles, I think. So I'm going to begin first. I'll say climate change. As a geologist, we knew that climate change was happening in the 1970s, and it was accepted in the peer-reviewed journals. It was not politicized. And this is one of the things I was going to say earlier. When I was younger, I always believed that science was above the political fray, that science would always be the last bastion that we could trust and rely upon. So if we want science to serve us, we've got to keep science honest. And so the honest science of the climate change, it's tricky, it's delicate, because climate change is happening and we are burning fossil fuels, emitting carbon dioxide into the air. And we have to say that we are contributing CO2 into the air. I mean, that's just a fact. The question then becomes, is it a problem? Is it really a problem? And are we emitting more than the Earth has ever seen? Is the Earth warming more than it's ever been? And we can't answer that without looking at cycles. You can't go back 5 or 10 years or 50 years to answer that question, because there are natural rhythms and cycles that are much longer than that. There are geophysical processes under our feet that are so poorly understood. And in the arrogance of the scientists, they've discounted these processes. They say it doesn't even come into play. What we know is that there is a cycle of about 12 to 13,000 years playing out right now. Last time we saw this was a very controversial time called the Younger Dryas. And that's their History Channel did a whole series. Graham Hancock is talking about this, and the whole series based on what happened. And we've been led to believe it's a one-off, that what happened in the Younger Dryas, that they were coming out of the Ice Age, there was a warming, the climate warmed, all of a sudden the temperatures dropped, there was a plunge where it cooled quickly, and then it warmed again into the era that we're in right now. When we go back and look in the records of the ice cores, for example, from Vostok and Epica and Greenland, what we find is that that's not the first time it happened. It has happened again, interestingly, about 26,000 years ago, which is the beginning of a precession of the equinoxes. And it happened again 13,000 years before that. And it happened again 12,000 years before that. So you have to say, is there a cyclic process that's happening here? What the new discoveries are showing is that what are called super volcanoes are responsible for those abrupt changes in climate. And those super volcanoes are driven by ripples in the magma of the mantle under our feet on a cyclic basis. There are processes happening in the core of the Earth. So the core oscillates creates heat and it creates ripples in the outer core and the mantle. And about every 13,000 years, something happens, and we'll talk about what this is, but it actually triggers a process where the mantle, the molten material in the mantle begins to breach the crust at the weak areas around the plate boundaries and where the crust is thin. And what that looks like to us on the surface is more active volcanoes, big volcanoes, more active earthquakes. But here's where it gets really interesting, John, is that magma is heating the crust from underneath. And as the crust heats from underneath, it heats the oceans. All right? The oceans are responsible for over 90% of the CO2 that is released into the atmosphere. And cold water holds a lot of gas. As the oceans warm, it holds less gas. It's releasing that CO2 into the atmosphere. There is a NASA.gov website. I didn't know we were going to go into this, so I don't have the whole thing here. But there's a NASA.gov website. They're saying over 90% of the CO2 is in the atmosphere is coming from the oceans. And to put that in the numbers, and I don't have the slides right in front of me, about 340 gigatons per year of CO2 coming from the oceans. That's a meaningless number until you compare it to what humans are contributing. Humans contribute about 40 gigatons per year. So the bulk of the CO2 is not coming from humans, not coming from fossil fuels, it's coming from the oceans. The oceans and the forests absorb most of what we're producing. The point is the ice is melting from underneath in Antarctica. It's melting from underneath in Greenland because the oceans are warming from underneath because we're undergoing this process, this cyclic process. So every 13,000 years, what you can see is there are super volcanoes. The most recent 13,000 years ago was called the Phlegraean Fields volcanoes in Italy. And then we have there's a New Zealand supervolcano. There is the same fields in Italy have happened twice. What we're seeing is this happen every 13,000 years. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Is those supervolcanoes and that volcanic activity is now linked to the migration of the magnetic field driven by the core. So the magnetic field, we're not going to reverse the poles anytime soon. And here's why I can say that. Of all the things to worry about, I would put that at the bottom of the list for this reason. 3 criteria have to be fulfilled for our poles to reverse. Number 1, the inner core has to slow, stop, and reverse its direction. And the outer core has to reverse its direction as well. And the magnetic strength has to drop below a threshold. All right. Right now, the magnetic field of our planet, we're between 0.25 and 0.65 Gauss. So we average about 0.5 Gauss. We would have to lose 90% of that before the fields could fall. We're nowhere near that, number 1. Number 2, the outer core is not slowing and reversing its direction. It's still flowing in the same direction. The inner core is going through a shift. And because of those, unless those criteria change, we're not going into a reversal, but we may be asking the wrong question. It's not so much about the reversal, which is rare. The last reversal happened about 780,000 years ago. It's called the Bruns-Maruyama reversal. The question we should be asking is, what about the migration of the magnetic fields? Because the fields can also weaken during a migration. It happens much more frequently. And we can lose up to 20% of our magnetic field during a migration without the poles doing a full reversal. And the migrations are temporary. So this is where it gets interesting. Now we know that the migrations happen about every 13,000 years. So there's a correlation between migration of the magnetic field and the supervolcanoes and the climate change. And we see this happen every 12 to 13,000 years. So I have a really beautiful slide I love to show. I asked the question, what are the odds of a supervolcanoes changing the climate on the Earth every 12 to 13,000 years? What we can say is in the last 780,000 years, the odds are 100% that it's going to happen because it has happened every 13 780,000 years, for the last 780,000 years. So this is what we're looking at now. So what it means is that we are living, we could stop burning all the fossil fuels, and we need to go clean and green. No mistake. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. And if we were serious about it, we've had the technology for over 70 years to do that. That's a whole different conversation. And the testimony on UAPs and disclosure ties into where that technology is. There's a whole separate
and
conversation.
why it's classified. Why some
exactly
classified.
Well, the point is that we are living in this cycle, and if we know that, John, doesn't mean you can stop the cycle, but we can sure do things differently to stack the deck in our favor. We can harden our power grids, for example. We can bury our power lines. We can stop building on floodplains. We can stop building high-rise condos 30 feet from the edge of the ocean, assuming that the ocean levels will always be static. And we do have the technology. If we saw the evidence that a super volcano was going to threaten Italy, for example, we have technology where we can relieve some of those volcanic forces before they cause the destruction they're having. We have all of that. So the point is that we tend to think of history as back then, and that we're separate. We're not taught that we're living those cycles right now, that we're living the same cycles. And as we embrace the truth of those cycles, it changes the narrative that we're being fed today, based on everything that I've just shared. I said, what if we were to achieve all of the climatary goals set out by the UN and the World Economic Forum? What if we achieved the CO2 levels, and what if we achieved the temperatures that they are proposing? What would the Earth look like? So they're proposing what they call pre-industrial levels. And so I looked at a geologic map, John, and if we were to achieve those levels, we have not seen those temperatures and those levels of CO2 since what we call the age of the Pleistocene. And during the Pleistocene, the CO2 levels dropped dangerously low. If your CO2 levels on the planet, on our planet, if they drop below about 180 parts per million, that's like a death sentence for the forests. We don't want that.
And hence for us.
All right. And so this is the whole point. And at that time, about 30% of the landmass was covered with ice. So we lost the forest. We lost a lot of life. Temperatures, average global temperatures are about 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now, they're about 56 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's 10 degrees temperature difference globally. And so you look at the Earth, if we were to achieve those goals with more ice, with low CO2, fewer forests, colder temperatures, and you have to say, who does that benefit? And the answer is not us. And so when we look at this, this is what I said, multiple competing visions and multiple competing agendas for what our lives should look like and what our planet should look like. And they are happening layers within layers within layers. And I believe that on some of those layers, there are people working that are simply pawns. They don't know what is happening. It's just their job. They're just trying to make a living and feed their kids. I know people in some of those organizations, and they're good people. They don't understand the role that their lives are playing within a framework of a bigger picture, and the framework of a bigger picture. So again, it's not about making somebody right, wrong, good, or bad. How can we solve the problems if we're not honest about the problems? And to be honest, we've got to allow the science to serve us and embrace what the science is telling us. And we are living a rare pivotal moment of a cyclic shift on our planet that is coinciding with the battle for our divinity. And it's all happening at the same time. All you could do is sit down and listen to good country music, you know?
Well,
That's all we can do. No, that's not all we can do.
I can see your clear wisdom in we have to assimilate to these natural cycles and grow our resilience so we make it through these periods and thrive through them. But how do we deal with the artificial attacks, which are now, they're not a theory, they're a reality. I know you're also following Dane Wigington's work geoengineeringwatch.org. How do we deal with that? A lot of people seem
Well, this is
powerless.
exactly, and this is where the conversation. This is where it's important. And again, it's not about making somebody right or wrong or good or bad. This is about being honest with ourselves. The White House released a congressional report. It was a congressionally mandated report exploring 5 technologies to block the natural light from the sun from reaching the Earth. And there's no secret. I mean, they released this report to the public, exploring 5 technologies. The one that they are proposing is high altitude jets spraying tremendous amounts of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to reflect the natural sunlight. And they chose sulfur dioxide because that is what is released from the natural volcanoes. So Mount Pinatubo, for example, when it erupted a few years ago, actually cooled our planet about 1 degree Celsius for the better part of a year because the sulfur dioxide was reflecting that light. The problem is, and there are a lot of, I mean, this is such a bad idea, and I wouldn't even entertain this idea. In the best of times, if we were to do this, the sulfur dioxide does not stay in the atmosphere. So it comes back to the Earth as acid rain. That acid rain kills phytoplankton in the oceans, the basis of the food chain, human health, all kinds of health hazards for this. And I believe the estimate is around 179,000 flights per year are required to keep the sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. Think of all the CO2 that's being emitted from those flights contributing to what it is
logical.
They say
that's too logical.
But here's the bigger problem. If the cycles that I just described, those 13,000 year cycles, are in play as we believe that they are, we are going to see natural, and we're already seeing an increase of magnitude 6 earthquakes, an increase of magnitude 6 earthquakes, 6 and above, and we're seeing an increase in volcanoes. So as those volcanoes increase, either one super volcano or many smaller volcanoes, they're kicking the sulfur dioxide into the air. It's going to cool the Earth anyway. If we augment that artificially, it's not like you can turn this stuff off and on with a switch. It takes years for this stuff to work its way through the system.
Greg,
if we're
are you saying we haven't been doing this? Because I'm convinced we already have been.
Well, we have been, but not on the scale that they are now proposing under the auspices of congressional approval. It has been happening, and they've been using different. Sometimes they're using sulfur dioxide. Sometimes they're using aluminum. Sometimes they're using different things. Jean, one of the things that I wanted to share with our community is from a scientific perspective. We all know climate is important, and no one is denying that. And I don't want to detract from the climate conversations in any way. However, there's a lot more going on with Earth processes that exceed beyond the climate. And I'd just like to share a couple of slides to help our viewers understand this. They may not have seen this. This is from the very prestigious journal Nature, a researcher named Rockstrom, and this is back in 2009. So you think back to 2009, before a lot of this was politicized. And what the scientists are telling us is there are 9 parameters, or what are called nine boundaries of processes in the Earth that must be honored and preserved for us to have what is called a safe operating space on the planet. In other words, if we don't have these 9 parameters in place, we're talking about possibly losing life on Earth. And let me just run through these really quick. Rockstrom is the researcher's name. The first of those climate boundaries, or planetary boundaries, is climate itself. The biosphere integrity is another one. The way that we use physical land above water is another one. Freshwater use, biochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol, stratospheric ozone, and what we call novel entities or human pollution. So what they're saying is these are systems that are interacting. We identify them as separate, but they're all interacting with one another, and they must be held in place. The boundaries must be honored for us to preserve life on Earth. And here's where this gets really interesting. What you're going to see is the image you're seeing on the screen right now shows that we have already crossed three of those boundaries, John, and it's not climate. Climate is not the boundary that we've crossed. We have already crossed the boundary of genetic diversity and biosphere integrity. In other words, we're losing life faster than we can catalog it due to largely environmental factors and toxins in the environment. And then there are two systems, I don't want to get really technical on this, in what is called biochemical flows, but it is the nitrogen and the phosphorus processes that are happening as nitrates from fertilizers filter into agriculture and into streams and rivers and lakes and things like that. If you look at the chart, they're in the red zone, they're off the chart. Look at quickly. You look at familiar times, I think everybody saw the movie Jurassic Park. So you look at the Jurassic period in the orange, and then the Triassic just to the left of that. So during the Triassic period, the CO2 levels were just under 2,000 parts per million. And during the Jurassic, they were over 2,000 parts per million. But look at that. Even though the CO2 levels were high, look at the temperatures. They dropped right around 150,000 years ago. So we're being told those high CO2 levels are always going to create the high temperatures. They may contribute, but there is not 100% correlation to that. So two things that we can see from this. Number one, we are not living the highest CO2 levels that we ever have. And when we have lived those in the past, Earth was very green and very lush. You're going to see that in a minute. During the Jurassic, the forests were lush, the forests were green. Yes, the oceans were warmer. Yes, there was less ice because the oceans were warmer. It was not a death sentence for the planet, as many are being led to believe. I've heard we've got maybe 12 years on the planet. I think, Jean, you probably heard that as well.
Yeah.
And then
I have.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I have. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, then you look at where we are for the average global temperatures. Are we the warmest? Is Earth the warmest it's ever been? And the answer is absolutely not. We're actually on the low end, the right-hand side, not up to the year, but you can see in terms of geologic time, we're on the low end of where those temperatures are. So let's see. Now, let's put this into perspective. What does this really mean? And I did this for myself because I wanted to answer these questions for myself. And so as people ask, I want to be able to share these. What does this mean for life? Well, during the Triassic period, CO2 is about 2,000 parts per million. The average global temperature was warm. It was around 122 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what it is in Dubai right now. So is it warmer? Absolutely. During the Jurassic, 1,000 parts per million CO2, the temperatures were much nicer. The average between 80 Fahrenheit during the day to 59 at night with 1,000 parts per million CO2. The Cretaceous period was just after that. We went back to 2,000 parts per million, but look at this. The temperatures were still between 82 during the daytime and 52 at night. So there is not 100% correlation between these two, and the whole idea that the CO2 is going to kill the planet. We had very green forest. We had abundance of life on land and in the sea during that time. Now, here's a little experiment that I did. If we were to meet the United Nations World Economic Forum CO2 targets, what would our planet look like? Well, CO2 right now, about 414.7 parts per million, and that was early in 2023. In 2010, this is the year they're looking at when they began these studies, CO2 is about 390.1 parts per million. The goal is a 45% reduction from 2010. This is the goal of the UN, their stated goal. So they went back to 2010. They say we want 45% less than that. So their target is 214.5 parts per million CO2. What does this mean? Current CO2 goals create the conditions that were last seen in the late Pleistocene. This is a quote. The study shows that for the entire Pleistocene era, carbon dioxide concentrations averaged 250 parts per million. So if we were to meet those goals, we're going back to Pleistocene. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's do the same thing. Average CO2 during the Pleistocene. Let's look at the temperature. Let's look at the ice. And let's look at the life. CO2 levels, 250 parts per million during the Pleistocene. Today, 417 parts per million. The average temperature of Earth during the Pleistocene, the average global temperature, 46. That's the average. That is a cold
That's
Earth.
cold, yeah.
Today, the average is 57. I mean, this has tremendous implications for agriculture, when we plant, when we harvest, the weather patterns, when it rains, when it snows, when the seasons occur, all of those things. This is fascinating. The ice. During the Pleistocene, 8% of the whole Earth was covered in ice. Some of that was ocean. 25% of the land was covered in ice. Today, only 3% of the Earth and only 11% of the land. So what does that mean for life? Well, during the Pleistocene, we had the extinction of a lot of large animals. 32, what we call megafauna species, we know disappeared. Megafauna is considered anything over 100 pounds in weight is megafauna. So we are megafauna.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, this is directly from NASA. This isn't my theory or my opinion. Earth is greener now than it has been anytime for the last 20 years because the CO2 levels are higher, and NASA is telling us this. So the Pleistocene, who benefits from the Pleistocene? I don't know the answer to that, John. I can speculate, but what I do know is it's not us. It's not the world that we live in today, and I think if most people understood this, it's probably not the world that they would like to live in. So I just wanted to share that to give some specifics when we're talking about climate. And the reason is because climate is going to be front and center for many of the policies that are being enacted, many of the laws that are being created, and many of the changes that we are going to be asked to make, forced to make in our lives based upon a narrative that the evidence simply doesn't support. And I want to be really clear. I have friends in politics. They're not scientists. They believe what they're being told. They're not bad people. They believe what they're being told, and they are adamant about creating these policies based on what they're being told. They're being told false information and cherry-picked data from obsolete science. At least this data does not support the narrative and the fear and the division. This is shredding our societies because young people are being told they don't have a future, and they're angry, and they feel justified in vandalizing and destroying any technology that they believe is contributing to the CO2. There is a narrative about our world that is being driven by information that's not supported by the evidence. That narrative is being used to frighten people, to make choices that are destroying their lives, destroying their business, destroying industries, and causing a lot of, in my opinion, suffering, unnecessary suffering, to achieve a goal, a nebulous goal from a handful of people that we didn't elect to represent us. It's their vision. And how that's happening and why it's happening, there's a whole story behind that. This all goes back to the beginning of our conversation, John. Our divinity, a big part of our divinity is freedom and sovereignty, and spiritual sovereignty, emotional sovereignty, and the sovereignty to live close to the earth in rural settings and rural environments, which are being discouraged right now. We're being encouraged to centralize into communities and cities rather than living in the rural areas. And I'm hesitating because it's, what we call the rabbit holes. But the bottom line here is this: at any time, localized living is the way to go in community. At any time, and now in our time of extremes, when we're seeing the buckling and collapse of financial systems and supply chains, this is, if we were ever going to live locally, now is the time to do it. Localized living is localized energy, localized food, localized economies, localized sources of energy where it makes sense to do that. And that is just the opposite of what we're